The wind was the first sound of morning on the high plains. It came crawling through the seams of the old Harrow house, sighing under the eaves, stirring the thin curtains, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faraway dust of hooves that no longer passed this way. In the half-light before dawn, the world felt endless and empty, as though time itself had forgotten to keep moving. Eliza Harrow rose before the sun. She always did. Habit had long outlived necessity. Her shawl was pulled close about her shoulders, and the boards creaked softly beneath her bare feet as she moved across the small kitchen. She set water to boil in the blackened kettle, wiped the frost from the inside of the window with her sleeve, and looked out upon the land that stretched in every direction, rolling hills dusted with snowmelt, the faint glimmer of the river far beyond the cottonwoods. Once this place had been a promise. Her husband, Thomas, had built the cabin with his own hands when the world still seemed full of future. His tools still hung on the pegs by the door, a hammer, a rusted saw, the handle of a shovel smoothed by years of use. She could not bring herself to move them. They were ghosts that kept the walls from falling quiet altogether. In the next room, June stirred beneath her quilt. The child was small and thin, her hair a tumble of brown curls that caught the morning light when she finally rose. She padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, clutching the rag doll that had lost an arm somewhere in the last year. "Morning, Mama," she said softly. Eliza turned with a faint smile that never reached her eyes. "Morning, sweetheart. Sit by the stove while I'll pour your tea." The water hissed and the scent of steeping leaves filled the air. Outside, a magpie called, its echo sharp against the open silence. Eliza poured a cup for herself and one for June, and they sat together in the stillness. No conversation, only the clink of cups and the faint hum of wind through the cracks in the walls. After breakfast, Eliza began her daily litany of chores. She swept the floor, though there was little dirt left to sweep. She mended a shirt that no one would wear again. Then, as she did every morning, she polished Thomas's rifle. The metal had grown dull with time, but she rubbed it until it caught the light again, as though he might step through the door any moment and reach for it. June watched her mother from the rocker, her doll in her lap. "Why do you still clean it, Mama?" she asked. Eliza paused, cloth in hand. "Because some things shouldn't be left to rust," she said. "Not even when their time is done." June nodded, as though she understood, though her small face was full of questions. Eliza returned the rifle to its place above the hearth. It hung there like a memory, silent, heavy, and certain. By midday, the wind had grown stronger. It howled against the shutters, carrying fine dust that whispered through the gaps. Eliza stepped out onto the porch, pulling her shawl tighter. The horizon shimmered with heat, though the air still held the chill of winter's edge. The corral was empty, the last of their stock sold months ago. The barn leaned like an old man in prayer, its boards silvered with sun and rain. She sat in the rocking chair Thomas had built the year June was born. It creaked under her weight, groaning like the voice of an old friend. From here she could see miles of open land, wild and unforgiving, a place that kept its beauty close, hidden beneath hardship. Sometimes, when the wind changed, she imagined she could still hear the echo of his laughter carried over the fields. But it was only the sound of the gate banging loose, the wind chasing through the grass. The day passed in quiet rhythm, the kind that had no beginning and no end. June gathered wild sage by the fence line, her small figure bright against the pale hills. Eliza watched her from the porch, the hem of her dress stirring in the breeze. There was a stillness in the child that came not from peace but from growing up in the shadow of silence. When dusk came, the sky bled into gold and violet. Eliza lit the lamp, trimmed the wick, and set a pot of beans to simmer over the fire. June sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing in the soot with a stick, whispering to her doll. The air smelled of wood smoke and rain far off in the hills. Later, as the fire dwindled, Eliza took down her brush and began to braid June's hair. Each strand slipped through her fingers, smooth and fine. She braided slowly, carefully, tying the end with a strip of faded ribbon. It was the same ribbon Thomas had once used to mark the edge of a plow line. Eliza's hand stilled a moment when she remembered that, the way he'd smiled, the dirt on his face, the simple peace of those days. June leaned back against her, half asleep. Eliza whispered softly, Time to rest, little one. When the girl had gone to bed, Eliza sat by the window with her cup of coffee staring into the dark. The stars were bright above the plains, cold and indifferent. She could hear the ticking of the clock, the soft rasp of the wind beneath the eaves. For a long while she did not move. The house stood quiet around her, like a shell left behind by something that had once been alive. She looked at her reflection in the glass, pale, lined, eyes older than her years, and thought, I have survived. But as the clock ticked on and the wind carried its long, low cry across the valley, she felt the truth press against her heart. Survival was not the same as living. The chair rocked once more, slow and steady, as the first coyote called to the moon. The sound drifted through the emptiness, lonely, endless, and achingly alive. Evening crept down the valley slow as spilled honey, tinting the plains with gold and ash. The wind had quieted, the way it sometimes did before a storm. A hush so deep that every sound, even the beat of a bird's wings, felt amplified against the silence. Eliza Harrow stood on the porch, a shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. Her eyes traced the far ridge where the trail bent out of sight. She had been stacking kindling when she first noticed the movement, a flicker of motion against the dying light. The shape of a rider cutting through the dust. He came slow, his horse limping, its coat salt-streaked from sweat. As he drew nearer, she could see the dark patch of a bandage tied around his left arm, and the way he sat in the saddle, straight-backed but weary, like a man held together by habit more than strength. Eliza's hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall. She lifted it steady and sure, though her pulse had begun to stir. The man reined in near the well, not 20 paces from the porch. He did not reach for a weapon, only tipped his hat in quiet acknowledgement. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and rough-edged, shaped by long miles of wind and dust. "Didn't mean to startle you. Just looking for water." The last of the sunlight caught his face. Not young, not old, with the kind of look carved by hardship rather than time. His eyes were gray, unreadable, but there was a steadiness in them, a patience that made her hesitate. Eliza nodded once, rifle still in hand. "There's water in the well," she said. "Buckets sound enough." He dismounted slowly, favoring his injured arm. The horse lowered its head to drink, the rope creaking over the well's edge. For a long while there was only the sound of water and the whisper of wind stirring through the grass. Finally the man straightened. "Name's Boone," he said. "Calder Boone. Been riding east since the Tetons. Horse took a bad step 3 days back. I'll be gone by morning, soon as he's fit." Eliza studied him. His clothes were dust-stained, boots cracked from travel. There was something deliberate in his movements, a quiet caution that spoke more of discipline than danger. She lowered the rifle, though not entirely. "Storm's coming," she said. "Won't be riding anywhere tonight. You can use the barn if you've a mind to." His hat tipped again, a faint ghost of gratitude in the gesture. "Obliged, ma'am." When he led the horse toward the barn, the twilight had already begun to thicken, turning the land into shades of violet and smoke. June had been watching from the window, her small face pressed to the glass, eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. "Who is he, Mama?" she whispered as Eliza came inside. "Just a traveler," Eliza said, though her tone held its old caution. "He'll be gone soon." But something in her voice trembled. Not fear exactly, but the weight of memory stirred from long stillness. That night the wind shifted. It began as a low hum through the cottonwoods, rising to a moan that swept across the plain, like the voice of something ancient. The scent of snow was in the air, sharp and metallic. Eliza moved through the house by lamplight, checking the shutters, stoking the fire. Through the cracks in the barn wall, she could see the flicker of a small flame. The stranger had lit a lantern. June crept to her side, eyes bright. "Can I see him?" she whispered. Eliza hesitated, then nodded once. Together they watched from the shadows. Calder sat on a bale of hay, his horse settled beside him. He was humming, soft, low, tuneless, as he cleaned the mud from his saddle. The sound was oddly comforting, like a lullaby carried from some forgotten place. June leaned her head against her mother's arm. "He doesn't seem bad," she murmured. "No," Eliza said quietly. "He doesn't." When they returned inside, the storm broke. The wind howled through the hills, shaking the shutters and driving snow sideways against the windows. The fire flared in the hearth, throwing warm light across the walls. Eliza sat in the rocking chair, staring at the flames, her mind caught between past and present. It had been years since any stranger had crossed their threshold. Years since another voice, another heartbeat had entered the rhythm of this place. She told herself it was only for the night. Yet the thought of another soul out there in the storm, alone, cold, wounded, unsettled something deep inside her. Before she went to bed, she lit a small lantern and set it by the window facing the barn. It was an old prairie custom, one Thomas had once told her meant safe passage for travelers caught in bad weather. She hadn't done it since the winter he died. The light burned steady against the dark. When morning came, the storm had buried the plains in white. Snow drifted high against the fences, and the sky hung low and gray, heavy with silence. The world looked softer now, but lonelier too. Eliza opened the door and stepped into the cold. The air bit her skin, sharp as glass. The barn door creaked open, and Calder Boone emerged, coat dusted with snow, his breath rising in clouds. "Looks like the storm's changed my plans," he said. Voice half a laugh, half a sigh. Eliza met his gaze. Behind him the land stretched blank and impassable, every road lost to snow. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "you'd best come inside for breakfast." The words left her mouth before she could think. The moment hung in the frosty air, simple, fragile, alive. And just like that, for the first time in years, the Harrow house was no longer empty. It lingered slow and heavy, pressing against the valley for 3 long days. Snow gathered along the fences, swallowed the trail, and buried the fields in quiet white. The world shrank to the size of the cabin and barn, 2 islands of warmth adrift in a sea of cold. Calder Boone stayed because there was nowhere else to go. He had offered, half out of pride, to dig a path toward the road, but the wind bit through his coat before he'd crossed 20 yards. Eliza had stood at the window, watching him disappear into the blur, and when he came back, shivering and pale, she only said, "You'll catch your death if you keep trying to fight it." So he stayed. The first morning, she found him splitting wood behind the house. His left arm was still bound, the sleeve rolled to the elbow, but he swung the axe with his good hand in a rhythm slow and even, every stroke precise. June watched him from the porch, boots too large for her feet, her breath fogging in the air. "Why's he doing that, Mama?" she asked. "Because someone has to," Eliza said, though there was a softness in her tone that hadn't been there before. By noon, the stack of logs had doubled. The scent of pine resin and fresh-cut bark drifted through the snow. When Calder came inside, his face red from the cold, he paused at the threshold, as though uncertain whether he was allowed beyond it. Eliza nodded toward the stove. "Hang your coat there." "Coffee's hot," he did as told, slow, cautious. The floor creaked beneath his boots. June slid him a cup with both hands, shy but eager, and he accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you, miss." They ate stew that night, beans and salt pork, the kind that sticks to the ribs and warms the blood. The 3 of them sat at the small table beneath the flickering lamplight, shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, the storm howled, but within those 4 walls the air was soft with the smell of food and wood smoke. Conversation came like thawing ice, slow, uneven, punctuated by long silences. Calder spoke little of himself. When pressed, he only said, "Been on the move since the wrong winter." The words carried weight, but he left them there. And Eliza didn't ask what he meant. He noticed the rifle above the hearth, the way it gleamed even in the dim light. "Good piece," he said quietly. "Looks cared for." Eliza nodded once. "It was my husband's." Calder's gaze flickered, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. He said nothing more. On the second day, the wind softened, though the snow kept falling. June spent the morning by the window, drawing with her fingertip in the frost. Little circles, hearts, a horse's head with a wild mane. Calder joined her at the table, showing her how to tie a sailor's knot with a piece of old twine he carried in his pocket. "Like this," he said, his voice gentle. "You loop it back through itself, see? Holds fast, but lets go when you need it to." June laughed when she managed to copy him. It was the first sound of joy to fill that cabin in years, and Eliza froze where she stood, one hand still on the kettle. The sound reached her like sunlight through cloud, startling, almost painful in its beauty. Later, Calder fixed the barn door that had been loose since autumn. Eliza watched him from the porch, the air sharp with cold, her shawl pulled tight. There was something steady about him, not loud or sure, but measured, deliberate, the kind of steadiness that made broken things seem mendable. When he caught her watching, he didn't speak, only nodded once and went back to his work. That evening, the storm eased. The sky opened in streaks of violet and silver. They ate in silence, the crackle of fire filling the gaps between words. June had fallen asleep before the plates were cleared, curled beneath her quilt, her doll tucked beneath her arm. Eliza washed the dishes while Calder dried them, their hands brushing once, twice, each time followed by the small awkwardness of distance restored. The fire burned low. The air felt different now, charged not with fear but with something unnamed and fragile. When the last of the embers dimmed, Calder reached for his coat. "I'll check the horses," he said. Eliza didn't stop him, though she wanted to. The wind outside had turned quiet, the snow whispering instead of screaming. She followed him a few minutes later, lantern in hand. The barn was dim, the air thick with the scent of hay and animals. Calder stood by the stall, his back to her, coat unbuttoned, shirt collar open. In the light of her lantern, she saw the scar, a thin, pale mark running beneath his collarbone, fading down toward his chest. He didn't turn when he spoke. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," she said softly. He faced her then, and she saw it, that same haunted distance she'd known in her own reflection. The look of someone who had buried more than one life and kept riding because stopping meant remembering. Was it the wrong winter? She asked before she could stop herself. Calder's eyes lifted toward the rafters, toward the small square of sky visible through the gaps in the boards. Stars burned faint and cold beyond. "It was," he said. "Lost more than I meant to. Been moving ever since, I reckon, trying to find a place the ghosts can't follow." Eliza lowered her gaze, the lantern trembling slightly in her hand. "They always follow," she murmured. "No matter where you go." He looked at her then, not with pity, not with longing, but with understanding. It was the kind of look that needed no words. Outside, the wind sighed through the cracks, soft as breath. When she turned to leave, he reached out and steadied the lantern's handle. Their fingers brushed, a moment brief as the flare of a match. Yet it lit something small and human inside the cold. That night, when Eliza lay awake in the dark, she could still hear him moving in the barn, the scrape of boots on wood, the low murmur of his voice as he spoke to the horses. It should have been a reminder of danger, of intrusion, but instead, it sounded like life returning to a place that had long forgotten how to breathe. By late March, the snow had begun to melt. The hills shone wet beneath the sun, rivers swollen and restless. The air smelled of thawing earth and distant rain, and for the first time in many months, color returned to the land. Pale green shoots among the sage, small blossoms trembling at the edge of the stream. Inside the Harrow homestead, life had found a quiet rhythm. Calder's arm had healed, though it still stiffened when the weather turned cold. He spent his mornings mending fences and setting new posts in the softened soil, while Eliza worked the garden she'd nearly abandoned. June followed them both, chasing the hens, her laughter rising clear and bright through the open air. It was peace of a sort, fragile, like thin ice over deep water. That afternoon, the sun had barely crossed its height when the sound came, distant. At first, a low tremor through the ground, then the steady rhythm of hooves, not one horse, but several. Calder straightened from the fence line, his face turning toward the ridge. "Riders," he said quietly. Eliza froze where she stood, the trowel slipping from her hand. No one came this far out unless they had reason. She shaded her eyes, squinting into the light. 3 men, maybe 4, rode hard across the valley, dust rising in long ribbons behind them. Their coats were trail-worn, their horses lean and sweating. Calder's voice was calm, but his jaw had tightened. "Best get June inside." Eliza didn't argue. She called for her daughter, ushered her toward the house, and barred the door. June's small hand clutched hers. "Who are they, Mama?" "Stay quiet," Eliza whispered. "Whatever happens, you don't come out till I say." She crossed to the mantel and took down her husband's rifle. The wood was smooth beneath her palms, the metal cold. Her heart thudded once, twice, and then steadied. She'd stood with this weapon before, though the last time it had been against a sickness, not men. Outside, the riders had drawn up before the house. The one in front dismounted, a broad man with a gray beard, and the weary swagger of someone used to getting what he wanted. His coat bore the mark of a ranch brand Eliza didn't recognize. "Boone," he called, his voice rough and carrying across the yard. "Calder Boone, you got something belongs to us." Calder stepped forward, dust clinging to his boots. His tone was even low. "Don't reckon I do," the man spat into the dirt. "Don't lie to me, son. You lit out of the double R with half a month's wages and a good horse. The boss ain't forgiving that easy." Eliza watched from the porch, rifle leveled, though her hands trembled just slightly. Calder didn't turn toward her, but she saw the line of his shoulders tight as drawn wire. "Your boss," Calder said, "paid for more than labor. Paid for silence, too." The bearded man's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Calder's voice stayed calm. "Means you ought to ride on before you start a kind of trouble that don't wash off." The tension was thick enough to taste. Like iron, like dust before rain. One of the younger riders shifted in his saddle, eyes darting between them. "Ain't worth it, Jack," he muttered. "Let him rot out here." But the older man wasn't listening. He drew his pistol, cocked it once, slow. "Last chance, Boone, hand over what's ours." Before Eliza could think, the rifle cracked, once sharp as thunder. The bullet struck the ground near the man's boot, kicking up a spray of dirt. He stumbled back, cursing. Eliza's voice rang out, cold and steady. "Next one won't miss." All eyes turned to her. The rifle didn't waver. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it, but her aim was true. The years had taken much from her, but not her will. The older man stared, his face twisting between rage and disbelief. "You'd shoot a man for him?" Eliza's gaze didn't falter. "I'd shoot a man for crossing my land." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Calder stepped forward, placing himself between her and the riders. "You heard the lady," he said. "Mount up and go." Something in his tone, quiet, final, broke the standoff. The men hesitated, muttered curses under their breath. One turned his horse. Another spat into the dirt. The bearded man holstered his pistol, glaring. "This ain't done," he said. "You'll see me again." "Maybe," Calder replied. "But not today." They rode off, their silhouettes shrinking against the pale horizon until they were no more than dust and distance. The silence that followed was immense, the kind that hums in the bones. Eliza lowered the rifle slowly, her breath coming hard. Calder turned toward her, and only then did she see the dark stain spreading across his sleeve. "You're hurt," she said, the words catching. He looked down, almost surprised. "Just a graze. Caught a splinter when you fired." But when she saw the blood dripping through his fingers, she knew it was more than that. Inside, she cleared the table and set out the old bandages. The room was lit only by the lamplight, soft, golden, alive with flicker. Calder sat still as she worked, his jaw clenched, breath slow. Eliza cleaned the wound with trembling hands, her sleeve brushed with his blood. She said nothing for a long time. Then quietly, "You could have told me they might come." "I hoped they wouldn't," he said. "Some debts don't bear telling." She tied the bandage tight, then sat back, looking at him across the lamplight. "We've all got debts," she murmured. "Ours just look different." Calder met her gaze, him steady, grateful, weary. "You didn't have to stand for me." Eliza's voice was low, almost a whisper. "You didn't have to stay." They held each other's eyes, two souls bound by wounds they hadn't chosen. Outside, the wind stirred again, carrying the smell of wet earth and spring on its breath. June stirred in her sleep in the next room, and the house settled into stillness once more. When Eliza finally spoke, it was not with fear, but with a quiet certainty she hadn't felt in years. "If you mean to stay a while longer," she said, "there's work enough here for two." Calder's answer came after a moment, a small, tired smile. "I reckon I could use the work." The lamplight trembled, catching the gold in his eyes, and for the first time, the Harrow house felt less like a place of ghosts and more like something living, fragile, but real. Summer came slow that year, but when it did, it came with a softness that felt almost merciful. The hills turned green again, wildflowers nodding beneath the fences, the air heavy with the scent of rain and grass. Rivers ran clear and quick, and the day stretched long beneath a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Calder Boone stayed, not as a guest and not as a drifter biding his time, but as a man quietly building something that might last. No words were spoken about it, no promises made, but his saddle gathered dust in the corner, and his horse grew round in the pasture. Each morning, Eliza found him already at work when she rose. He mended what winter had broken, fence rails, tools, the old porch step that had groaned underfoot for years. June followed him like a shadow, learning the names of things: spade, plow, bridle, the language of labor that tied one day to the next. Eliza watched from the doorway sometimes, hands resting on her apron, the early light slanting across the yard. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen her daughter so alive. June's laughter came easily now, ringing through the fields as she chased after a chicken or splashed in the stream. Calder never scolded. He just smiled, patient as stone, teaching through quiet example. He fixed the roof before the first summer rain, climbed it one afternoon with nothing but a hammer, a coil of rope, and that easy calm of his. Eliza steadied the ladder while he worked, shielding her eyes from the sun. When he slipped once, her breath caught in her chest, but he only laughed softly, brushing the dust from his palms. "You trust me up here?" he called down. "I trust the nails," she replied, though there was a faint smile behind her words. By dusk, the roof was sound again. The rain that came that night pattered steady against the shingles, and not a single drop made its way through. For the first time in years, Eliza slept through a storm. Calder's presence changed the rhythm of the house in small, almost imperceptible ways. The mornings began with the smell of coffee and the scrape of boots by the door. The evenings ended with the soft hum of his voice as he told stories by lamplight. Quiet tales of horses and faraway plains, of places where the stars looked close enough to touch. June began braiding her hair differently. 2 braids now, one over each shoulder. "One for Mama," she said, "and one for Calder's stories." Eliza said nothing, but she felt something stir deep in her chest. Not fear this time, not grief, something gentler, like warmth returning to numb fingers. They planted corn together in late May. Calder dug the furrows while Eliza followed, dropping the seeds with careful hands. June carried the bucket behind them, singing tunelessly into the wind. The sun was bright and the soil smelled rich, alive. Calder paused once, leaning on the handle of the hoe, and said, "You've good land here." Eliza shaded her eyes. It was Thomas's choosing. He said the soil had memory. Calder nodded slowly. He was right. Land like this, don't forget the ones who work it. The words hung in the air, gentle, not prying, and she found herself grateful for them. As the weeks passed, the house began to change, too. Calder straightened the porch rail, replaced the missing pane in the window, and fixed the rocking chair that had always leaned a little to one side. When Eliza sat in it again, it moved smooth and silent, like time rewound. She caught herself rocking in it some evenings, shawl over her shoulders, watching the sun sink into the hills. Calder would be near the barn then, brushing down the horses, and for a moment everything felt right in its place. It wasn't love as the world might name it. There were no declarations, no embraces by the fire. It was quieter, found in the way Calder poured her coffee without asking, or how she saved the last biscuit for him without thinking. It was in the shared labor, the shared silence, the way their eyes would meet across a room and hold there for a heartbeat too long. One evening, after a day of long work, Eliza found him sitting on the porch steps, a knife in his hand and a small block of wood in the other. He was carving something, slow, deliberate strokes that curled shavings into his lap. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Don't rightly know yet. Guess I'll see when it's done." When she came out the next morning, the block had become a small bird, wings spread as if caught mid-flight. He'd set it on the porch rail beside her rocker. The wood was smooth beneath her fingers, and for reasons she couldn't name, it brought tears to her eyes. Later that day, as they worked side by side in the garden, Eliza spoke without meaning to. "When you first came, I thought you were just another ghost passing through." Calder paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. "And now, She looked out over the field, rows of green breaking through the soil, the sun shimmering on the river. "Now," she said, "I think maybe the ghosts were leaving. And you just happened to walk in." He smiled then, and small, almost hidden but true. That night the three of them sat on the porch beneath the stars. The air was thick with the scent of lilac and pine. June had fallen asleep in Eliza's lap, and Calder leaned back against the rail, whittling another shape by the lantern's glow. Fireflies drifted through the dark, blinking slow as heartbeats. Eliza felt the weight of the day settle gently around her, not heavy, but whole. She thought of how long it had been since peace had felt like this, earned, quiet, and alive. Love, she realized, wasn't a blaze that burned everything bright and brief. It was this, the steady fire that kept the night away, the warmth that built over time until it became a kind of home. And for the first time in years, she did not dread the morning. The years passed the way seasons do on the high plains, quiet, steady, without ceremony. The land changed first. The young trees grew tall along the creek bed, their leaves turning gold each fall. The fence lines held firm through storm and wind. The roof stayed tight through the years of rain and thaw. The Harrow place no longer looked forgotten. Smoke curled from the chimney most days. The porch swept clean, the garden alive with corn, herbs, and the wild sunflowers June planted one summer and never stopped tending. By the time the harvest sun began to fade again, Eliza's hair had grown silver at the edges. The fine lines on her hands had deepened, but her gaze was steady, calm, the look of a woman who had endured and softened both. Calder's shoulders had stooped some, the years of work written in the easy slowness of his movements. His hands, rough and scarred, carried no restlessness now. Autumn settled around them like a sigh. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and apples, and every evening the sky blazed with the kind of gold that belongs to endings. June was nearly grown, 16 that year, with a spirit bright and unafraid. She rode her mare, a chestnut with a white blaze, across the open fields at dusk. Her laughter carried on the wind, wild and alive, echoing against the far hills. Calder always watched her go, one hand shading his eyes, a half-smile tucked beneath his mustache. "She rides like she was born to it," he said one evening as he sat beside Eliza on the porch steps. Eliza nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting faintly. Her father would have been proud. Calder didn't answer. He didn't have to. They'd stopped filling silence with words long ago. The rocking chair creaked beneath her, a familiar rhythm. The fields shimmered with the last light of day, each blade of grass tipped with gold. The sky, wide and endless, began to turn the color of old embers. Behind them, the house breathed, floorboards warm, windows glowing with lamplight. The same house that had once echoed hollow and cold now hummed quietly, filled with the small, living sounds of evening. A kettle singing low, a dog stretching near the hearth, the faint rustle of pages from June's room. Eliza's eyes softened as she watched her daughter's figure grow smaller against the horizon. There was no ache in the sight, no fear of what lay beyond the fence. The world had opened to them again, and in that openness, she'd found peace. When June finally turned her horse back toward home, the first snow began to fall, a thin, delicate flurry drifting through the fading light. The flakes caught in her hair as she rode, glinting like small stars. Calder reached across the porch rail and took Eliza's hand. His touch was steady, familiar, the touch of years of things built quietly and held with care. "You remember that first snow?" he asked, voice roughened by the wind. Eliza's gaze drifted toward the barn, toward the memory of a stranger's horse standing half buried in white. "I do," she said softly. "It was colder then. The wind. It used to sound different?" Calder nodded, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Still the same wind?" She smiled faintly. "No, it's changed. It doesn't sound lonely anymore." They sat like that for a long while, the snow coming down thicker now, the world wrapped in white and gold. The quiet between them was deep but kind, the quiet of people who had seen sorrow and chosen to stay. Later, when the lamps were lit and June had gone to bed, Eliza walked to the small cedar chest at the foot of her own. From within, she lifted her old wedding dress. The lace had yellowed, the hem frayed, but it still carried the faint scent of lavender she'd stitched into its seams years ago. She hung it by the window, the fabric whispering in the light draft. It swayed slightly in the lamplight, pale as ghostlight, and she studied it for a long moment. It no longer filled her with pain, only remembrance. That dress had once been the symbol of a life that ended too soon. Now it was simply part of the story, a piece of the past folded gently into the present. Calder stepped into the room behind her, his shadow stretching long across the floor. "You sure you want that there?" Eliza turned, her eyes soft. "It doesn't haunt me anymore. It belongs here, same as everything else we've lived through." He nodded once, slow, then reached for her hand again. "Then leave it be." Outside, the wind rose, whispering through the pines. But it was a gentler voice now. Not the lonely keening that once haunted the hollow boards, but the low hum of something enduring, something alive. The house, the land, the people, all of it held together by quiet, patient time. The firelight flickered across their faces, gilding the lines and scars alike. June stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about the mare, about spring. Eliza brushed a strand of hair from her brow, then leaned into Calder's shoulder. "You ever wish you'd kept riding?" she asked. He gave a soft, rumbling chuckle. "Some nights I dream I did. But I always wake up right here." "And that's enough?" He looked at her, eyes warm beneath the years. More than enough. The snow deepened outside. The wind carried the faint cry of a coyote somewhere beyond the ridge. The lamp burned low, its flame steady as a heartbeat. Eliza closed her eyes. She thought of the long road that had led here, the grief that had once hollowed her, the quiet stranger who'd come at dusk, the small miracles of mended fences and laughter returned. The years had not erased the ache of what was lost, but they had filled the space around it with life, with the kind of love that does not demand, only stays. By morning, the world would be white again. June would ride out to check the herd. Calder would stoke the fire, and Eliza would braid her hair the way her daughter did now. 2 braids, even and sure. The house would breathe. The fields would sleep beneath snow, and the wind, once so mournful, would carry the memory of all they had built, not of loneliness, but of belonging. In the last light of autumn, peace had finally come, not as thunder, but as the softest thing in the world.